hear about research on capacity, information, and other gaps in stakeholder engagement practices. And under knowledge and information, you'll hear about proposed advisory services and non-state stakeholders. And right before I introduce our moderator, I'd like to very briefly, on behalf of the SAN Steering Committee, say that we would like to take a moment to stand in solidarity with our members and others who are being affected by the COVID-19 crisis and the related economic uncertainties at this time. We've actually been hearing from some of you about your lack of connectivity and your inability to get through to our webinars, about the stress of the new normal, how some of you are in countries that are just starting to reopen businesses. We really enjoy hearing your stories and keeping up to date on what's happening on the ground where you are. And so on behalf of the steering committee, we'd just like to say that we would like everyone to stand with those, especially in developing countries, where the health crisis is being exacerbated by the ongoing impact of climate change and environmental degradation. We can't forget that aspect in all of this. And so, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our esteemed moderator, Margaret Ansplon, the Executive Director of the Climate Markets and Investments Association, CIMA. CIMA is an independent not-for-profit trade association that has been providing leadership from the private sector in the delivery of climate investment policy and market mechanisms since 2008. Margaret Ann oversees CIMA's mission to stimulate a shift in the direction and scale of private and public financial flows into investments, which are consistent with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Now, also very important to note is that Margaret Ann is a current and past climate fund observer. That is for the Climate Investment Funds, the Forestry Carbon Partnership Facility, and the Green Climate Fund. And she also is a member of the SAN and a member of the Resource Mobilization Working Group. So, Margaret, I now turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. It's really good to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, wherever you are in the world. The Stakeholder Advisory Network on climate finance are better known as the SAN and its steering committee members and its members joining from around the world. And I'd also like to acknowledge those joining from outside, Julia, I believe you're with the Adaptation Fund NGO network. So thanks for your participation, and we hope we get to learn a lot here today. I see we have a small group of participants who have joined us from various points in the world, and it's all the better for being able to have a candid, in-depth discussion involving our participants as we deep dive into the topics of the SAN's proposed lines of action. This time it's going to be focused on its products and services and its resource mobilization strategy. So I've been involved with the SAN since the inception, and I've seen the developments. Before I introduce today's speakers and the two deep dive segments, I'd like to just address a few housekeeping issues. Just a friendly reminder to please mute yourself. If you'd like to ask a question, either please use the chat function to send your comments or ask any questions. There will be a dedicated 35-minute, maybe even more, time for open discussion, which we really want you to join into. So you'll have plenty of time to join the discussion. We really look forward to hearing your views and taking your time for these questions. So as I mentioned, today's webinar is on resource mobilization for the operationalization of the SAN. We're one of the 5 working groups, and I'm part of this working group. We've got 2 other working group members who will present today, and both are on the steering committee. But before we move forward with these presentations, let's go back briefly in time to share a bit about how we got here. So Cynthia, could you go to the next slide, please? Or Andrea, sorry, could you go to the next slide? So the SAN really grew out of the Paris Agreement and the specific mandate it provided for climate finance to be transparent, accountable, and cooperative with the goal of achieving effective governance. Back in October 2015, the Joint Trust Fund Committee created this concept note for the SAN and set its mission to strengthen the partnership of non-state actors with climate finance entities through collaboration, research, advocacy, networking, and partnerships. The Trust Fund Committee's vision was a dynamic partnership that fosters inclusiveness, interdependence, and cooperation at all levels of climate finance and investment to meet the needs of those most vulnerable to climate change. The SAN aims to allow for more coherence, cooperation, and coordination in the work of non-state actors, including civil society organizations. We often refer to these as CSOs, indigenous peoples, and the private sector. The SAN seeks to improve climate governance systems by aligning them with the goals and values of country ownership and to drive inclusive participation, transparency, integrity, and accountability at all levels of decision-making, leading to a more efficient provision of mobilization of climate finance. So now the SAN shapes its vision and mission along the lines of how stakeholder engagement and participation of non-party stakeholders in climate governance is an essential priority. What we have here on this slide is a brief view of the SAN's history. SAN is 4 years old, so we're growing up and we've made quite a bit of progress each year. Officially launched at COP22 back in Marrakesh. Since then, the Climate Investment Fund has provided seed funding for the financial years 2017 to 2019. They've supported our annual meetings, providing a part-time coordinator and agreeing to fund consultants to help operationalize the SAN. From November 2016 to April 2018, there was a steering committee of 5 members from civil society, the private sector, and indigenous peoples groups, which oversaw the SAN and really helped set it up. There was this second interim steering committee of the SAN was elected in April of 2018, comprised of 7 members coming from CSOs, indigenous people, private sector, and across a broad range from East Asia, Africa, Europe, Latin America, and the US. They were tasked with strengthening the foundation of the network as it transitions to a fully independent entity. So that's great. And let's move on to the next slide, because now, what and where are we today when we go into this deep dive? So there's been 5 working groups that were launched on critical issues to the SAN. Just a reminder, again, these were on election process and governance. It's essential to our legitimacy, to how we function internally and how we govern ourselves. There was membership about who we are, products and services around what we do, and legal arrangements and hosting. Essentially, it's how we function with respect to the broader climate finance and civil society world. We also had this fundraising strategy under resource mobilization. How do we fund ourselves and get the means to fulfill our mission? There's been 6 listening and update meetings held with fund secretariats, donor governments, and NGO networks. We've had an open forum assembly. We've got a fundraising strategy. We've got a draft SAN information plan for products and services. And our goal this next year is to move from the organizational phase to begin to have impact through our activities, the products and services you're going to hear about today. So the SAN, we've got a strategy, we've got a budget, which we need to fund, an action plan, and we're moving forward with independent funding. Now, independence is important because independence is important so that we can have impact, and we're going to go into that. First of all, though, we're going to present our first presenter who will be working and showing about the SAN proposed lines of action. We're going to have Claudia Seguno. I'm not pronouncing her name well. I'm so sorry, Claudia. Seguno. Yes, exactly. And she's a member of the steering committee. She's also the Forest Investment Program Observer for Indigenous People. She is a forestry specialist for Human Rights and Environmental Justice Program from Law, Environment, and Natural Resources, or DAR is its acronym in Spanish. And for those that don't know, DAR is a Peruvian NGO committed to building and strengthening environmental governance and promoting the exercise of human rights for the development of an inclusive and sustainable Amazon basin. Claudia, we're looking forward to hearing you. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you so much, Margaret. Good morning to everybody. Thank you to be in this webinar, number 2. As Cynthia told us, I belong to the Products and Services Working Group. And as a working group, we got many meetings before this. Here is Muhammad, that was part of this working group. Thank you, Muhammad, to be also joining us today. The challenge of the Products and Services Working Group was to define a list of potential products and services. So we could also call outcomes and impact, which is all about getting the sun to deliver on its mission. So we elaborate a series of deliverable actions that could both serve the mission, but would also be viable, fundable activities that could attract the interest of our supporters. This challenge has led to a long quest which involved the steering committee as well as the working group in exploring the many known gaps and shortfalls that limit the capacity of observers to perform their jobs well, representing their constituencies, sharing information, making informed decisions, among others. So we boil these gaps and shortfalls into 3 categories: related to voice and representation, capacity and information. These are reflected into the 3 proposed lines of action of the SAM presented here. First is the standard setting, the capacity building, the knowledge information, that is ensuring that climate funds are held to high standards of accountability, transparency, and participation of beneficiaries and stakeholders, while practices may vary from one fund to other fund. These are based on common shared principles. So making sure that observers have the skills and the tools they need to do their jobs from the moment they are elected and onboarded. Ensuring that access to information is a reality, that the information is timely, approachable, shared among peers, and informed decisions. More than a producer or a clearinghouse, the SAM will act as a disseminator of information and knowledge. And this is what it could mean in terms of our actual products and services, the following slides. Please, Andres, the following slides. Thank you. So we have discussed with our working group, and we just proposed this list of potential products and services. In the standard setting includes principles and standards for citizen stakeholder engagement in climate finance, certification and verification of adherence of compliance with the stakeholders engagement standards, stakeholder engagement good practices, current status of stakeholder engagement in climate finance, advocacy and public awareness, promotion of stakeholder engagements, private sector's engagement, mapping bilateral climate fund standards and other activities of engagement with non-state actors, best practices in monitoring portfolios and in also individual investments, best practices monitoring effectiveness of climate funds mitigation efforts. The next slide, it's going to be about the capacity building. Yes, please, Andres. Thank you. So capacity building could include diagnostic tools for effective stakeholder engagements in multilateral climate finance. Also, the technical assistance and advisory services for climate funds on stakeholder engagement. We also consider that it is important empowering a specific stakeholders group about indigenous people, gender, most vulnerable, sectors. So also we propose advisory services to non-stakeholders, could be observers and constituencies. Observer capacity building. This is also, we believe that it could be the new observer inductions about the self-guided in-network training, the Climate Funds Secretariat role, maybe via training or short course, bridge technical gaps, and how effectively observers will expand, applying their capacity developed through the training envisaged. We also propose about hosting or participating in knowledge sharing events, convening observer members' annual event, and prioritizing climate funds investment decisions. And the final list proposed that we had proposed is about the knowledge and information products and services that could include. We differ in two types of about knowledge. It's one about knowledge development and also could be a knowledge sharing. In the first case, we include the original research and policy positions on key issues about the stakeholder engagements on climate finance, the research on capacity information in stakeholder engagement practices. Also, we could assess and compare implementing agency and national agency standards on stakeholder engagement for project designs and implementation. Also, we consider about the mapping in-country expertise on climate finance stakeholder engagement to expand the SAN's individual members. We got also the proposal of linking oversight of global climate finance and country-driven on owned approaches. We also could develop a model for local stakeholders, directories, and social baseline studies of non-state actors in climate funds. And the second type of knowledge is about knowledge sharing. We could access to information through searchable repository of public information from climate funds. Another potential could be tools or technology for observers constituency coordination, creating online data bank of existing climate finance observer analysis and frameworks, establishing SAN's online presence, website, social media, and we consider that the observer networking and the knowledge exchange, it's too important that we had already deal with social media and peer learning mechanisms. That is all our list of potential work products and services that we could offer, and we want you that you could choose one of which one we could prioritize in this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. That was a lot of information, and you did that just beautifully. We're going to do, that's a lot of information for the audience, and what we'd like to do, though, is run a little poll, if you can, about what of the products and services that you heard of, what do you think the SAN should maybe be focusing on delivering first? So, Andrea, are you able to run up the poll for us? If this doesn't work, then we'll move on to the next presentation. But now that the knowledge is fresh, is it working?
I'll have it up in a second.
Okay, no problem. It's just that since you've just Claudia's just delivered all of this, I'd really like people to. There it is. Yeah. So here's this. Andres, do you want to tell them how to do this, maybe, or?
Sure. So this is an online polling tool. We've posted up a question: where should we start among quite a number of different products, potential products and services within those three broad lines of actions? We'd love to hear from you from these examples, or perhaps that's something else. What do you think we should do first? What should we prioritize? The way to go about this is, if you can go into your browsers, ideally on your mobile phones, and go to menti.com, and with the code listed above 96792, you'll have access to the poll, and you could vote actually for one of these. And if you're not contemplated by any one of those 7 that have been suggested, you can signal other, and then in our discussion we can discuss what other specifically might mean. And you're able to vote for one, or you're able to prioritize 1, 2, 3 among the choices. There you go. We've got the movement.
This is fun, Andreas. This is really good what you've done. And thank you for those that are voting. Please do vote. It's really important. Gaining your participation. Yes, we can talk about this, but it's really important to see what your views are. So if you can take the time, that would be just brilliant. Please go into your browser, vote, so that we can take away, for us to get to these products and services has been a long haul, as Claudia mentioned. There's been a lot of meetings, a lot of thoughts. We take your feedback, whatever you say, and we take it to heart, and we're building this for the group. So your votes here matter, and they're important to us. And obviously we'll take the time afterwards to go on these furthers, but it really helps us having, even in this small group, an idea of what it is. So it looks like observer capacity building and stakeholder engagement are first. Okay, well, that sounds very interesting, and we're going to talk about that afterwards. I like these as well. Let's move on, though, to the next presenter, who's really going to talk about resource mobilization. And many of you might already know Laurence Connell. He's referred to as LAD. We all call him that. And LAD is also on the steering committee. He is the Environment Director for the Bank Information Center, which is an organization that works to reform the development finance system to prevent harm to people and to the planet. So LAD, in his role as Environment Director, is really the lead on the Bank Information Center work on environment and climate, with a specific focus on the role of forests in sustainable development and the importance of secured land title for Indigenous and forest peoples. So we're going to go back to the presentation, and we're going to hear from LAD on this.
Thank you, Margaret Ann. Thanks very much for the introduction. And I don't know about anyone else, but when I heard Claudia's presentation about all these different things that the SAN can do, I thought that was pretty exciting. There were 11 different things just in the knowledge development and knowledge sharing category of activities. So, there's clearly a lot of what the SAN can do. And really the question is, how do we get to do it? So that's what I wanted to talk about. And I'd also like to kind of walk you through what our mindset has been during this. Initially we started with the idea of fundraising. And I think, when I joined the SAN, I and other civil society representatives felt it was wrong for the SAN as a network of observers to be funded by one fund that was, that our members were observing. And there's some justification in that observers need to be independent. But at the same time, the CIF is supporting the SAN's members with the goal of improving their knowledge and ability to do their job. And the SAN itself is not an advocacy organization, except in advocating for the role of climate finance observers. So at this stage, the SAN and the CIF do share some of the same goals. But let me start on this slide. As I said, our mindset was one of fundraising. We had the CIF as an incubator that was the sole source of financial support for the SAN. And as I mentioned, there's this sense that the lack of autonomy does compromise the mandate. If you look at the arrow going up to the center of the slide, then we had a kind of logic for changing that, which was, well, number one, really actually that the non-state stakeholders need independence to be effective, and also the donors want transparency and accountability. And so we thought that we would go, look for multiple funders, and we had three logical types of fundraising partners. One was the governments, second was the funds themselves, and later, once we established a track record, was foundations. But let's go ahead to the next slide. So this is a similar slide, but I wanted to highlight really the change in our mindset, that we went from a fundraising mindset to a resource mobilization mindset. So again, if you start out by looking at the left, yes, we've been dependent on donors, on one donor in particular, the climate investment funds. But when we did the outreach to the potential donors that we were thinking of, that is the fund secretariats and the governments, and when I'm talking about the fund secretariats, I'm talking about all 5 of the multilateral funds. So we had the Adaptation Fund, the Climate Investment Funds, the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, the Global Environment Facility, and the Green Climate Fund. So those are the 5 funds. And then governments that we reached out to include all 10 governments that are donors to the climate investment funds. So those are mostly European governments plus the United States. But we got this feedback from those governments, and they wanted to know, well, kind of what is it that you're going to do? What do you bring to the table as the SAN? How are you going to contribute to to the function of observers? So that forced us to think more about what is the value proposition of the SAN. Donors want transparency and accountability because that decreases the risk that their funds are going to be misused or just not well used. So donors do see the value of observers being effective. Stakeholder engagement is really a risk reduction strategy, both for the donors and for the funds. And so we began to think, well, what are the things that we're doing? It's these products and services. It's setting standards. It's building capacity. It's sharing knowledge. Those are services that actually have a value, and therefore we can access different revenue streams. So we've gone from the mindset of the SAN being purely a recipient organization to what one could call a think and do tank. So we are doing the idea of doing some research plus actually helping our members, our observers, the non-state stakeholders with their work. And so that brought to mind 3 logical types of clients. And of course, it's not a surprise. The clients who will benefit from this are the climate funds, again, because observers represent a form of risk reduction. The members, of course, because they want to be able to do their jobs better. So there's that's a clientele of the stakeholder advisory network. And then the climate funders, who are primarily governments, but also, again, in the future, we think foundations, or the one of the donors, for example, to the FCPF is the Nature Conservancy. So it's possible that some of these big international NGOs would also see a value in sand. So that's where we are now in terms of our resource, highlighting what is our value proposition to all these different constituencies. And we really look forward to hearing your thoughts on that. So I will leave it there, and I think we'll go on to the next slides. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Lad, for going through that. And, you know, we recognize that the SIF has graciously nurtured the SAN with seed funding and technical support, but that just covers the operating cost to help develop the SAN concept and move it towards independence. The former and current SAN steering committee recognize the value of the support, but also recognize the urgent need to diversify its funding resources if it is to become fully operational, sustainable, and independent. You know, we're in the process, we're not looking to divorce at all from the SIF, but rather we're seeking the diversification of funding resources and partnerships, because this leverages the SIF's seed money and credibility and its assurance of standards of transparency, accountability, and inclusion. But that's enough from me and enough from us. What we want to hear is from you. And so we've got another little poll, this time based on what you've just heard. What is kind of the one thing we or you think we can do to help mobilize resources for the SAN? So again, if you go back to www. I'm putting it again on chat, .com, and you put in that code, 96792 is the code. What one thing do you think we can do to help mobilize resources for the SAN? If you have an idea, if you want to be part of it, if you want to, I'm going to vote myself right now. Oh, good, I like this. So there's good governance so far. Good. Do you think that we're working with the right people, that is the funds themselves? Are there other people that you think we could, are there other people you think that we could, so that's good. Oops, I think that's meant to be build relationships, but that's okay. Engage observers. Okay, these are good. Create partnerships. These are interesting. All right. Because we've been asking ourselves this, which is all part of, we call it fund. I like Lad's idea better of we calling it resource mobilization, because it's not just about fundraising. It's also about taking the funds that we have or the knowledge that we have and utilizing that for best practices and streamlining. Getting something off the ground, though, is not necessarily the easiest thing to do. So maybe we should just open up the floor, in fact, and ask people if they've got questions. We're a small group, which is just brilliant in some ways, even though we want more of the SAN members on the call. At the same time, it really allows us to have a good open discussion. So thank you so much for those that participated in the Menti survey. But let's open up the floor to questions. Does anybody have any particular questions for Claudia or Lad based on what you've heard? Well, I had some previously, or I reached out to a few people prior to this, and one of the questions that they asked was really, and so maybe Claudia, this is for you and for Andreas, is how will the SAN look to set standards for observers? Or could you, yeah, see, and somebody even just wrote improve observer standard. Maybe Claudia or Andreas, how could you tell us what you think this might look like? Again, remember, this is conceptual in nature right now, but it's really about building something Claudia, do you have any thoughts on how you guys, how the team thought that observer standards would be created?
Maybe this is something I can come in, Claudia, if you don't mind, or after you.
No, it's fine. It is fine.
Yep. So Andres Falconer here. The setting standards, setting higher standards, or raising the bar of stakeholder engagement, stakeholder observer participation is one of the stated goals of the SAN in its strategy way back then. I think in the 2018 assembly. So what we're trying to do is to operationalize it. How is it that we're setting, that we're raising the bar or setting standards? Every climate fund has a set of governance principles and practices pertaining to how civil society, beneficiaries, marginalized voices, etc., can engage. They have different mechanisms in terms of participation of these stakeholder observers. Some have observers per se, some engage with civil society networks in some capacity, some have large constituencies, others have specific, more narrowly defined mechanism. We think it's very positive that each of the funds have their own principles and practices. We're not advocating that they should all be the same, but what the SAN is advocating is that they should be based and built around a common set of high-level principles that ensure voice, that ensure the capacity of that voice to be listened to, and give some give some teeth to that voice, so that voice really matters. So advocating for higher standards and setting those principles, setting them in stone, actually writing them down as a SAN standard that the funds would be then held to account is the idea behind the standard setting. So even if they have different practices, they should be based on common high-level principles that can be tracked, that can be verified, that can be monitored. And as Lad said earlier, while the SAN is not an advocacy organization, the one thing we do advocate for is precisely that the voice of civil society, the voice of indigenous people, the voice of beneficiaries, the voice of marginalized groups is listened to and acted upon. That's the basic idea.
That's brilliant. That's great. Thank you so much for going deeper into that. You know, we've got a small group here. Maybe we could ask participants to identify themselves and ask why they joined today and how maybe these products and services that the SAN is proposing to develop would help their work. Does anyone is anybody willing to unmute themselves and introduce? Otherwise I will ask you to unmute yourself and introduce yourself. Anyone?
Hello, my name is Iqbal Tabish. I am from Pakistan. So the last time I could not attend the first webinar due to some of my pre-scheduled unseen engagements. I have gone through the notes which have been very well prepared and give some sort of insight into moving us toward the second webinar. When we think of this SAN, and the very primary thing which comes to our mind is the sustainability of the SAN itself. And the sustainability, in fact, revolves around two basic things. What is the level of the work and the services we offer? And secondly, in order to carry forward them, is the funding arrangement finance as well, which is crucial. So what in fact I was thinking in fact that in view of the prevailing regime that is due to the COVID-19, and we have been in our houses, and this COVID in fact has negatively impacted the economic growth. So subsequently, the member states may not be able to contribute to the fund to the extent they used to do in the past elbows. So that is the first thing that also we have to keep in mind. The second, at the one hand, if this COVID issue in fact has negatively impacted the commercial and the economic activities at work, but at the same time, it has some positively and significant impact on the climate change pattern in the world as well. So why not we send as the stakeholder advisory group may come up with an idea to conduct and induct a study that what was the positive outcomes are coming from this COVID, and what will be the benefit to the climate, and what would be the stakeholders intake, and what are their thoughts, and what are their way forward to combat even the challenges of the climate change in the post-COVID regime as well. Coming to the fundraising, which to me is very, very crucial for the fundraising. The document which I have seen that I learned that there is some fund is still available. So why not some of the fund maybe is spent to improve the quality of the sand, the whole product and services, its standards, its legitimacy, its strengthening its mechanism, so that it could become such an effective, sellable document for the other non-state fundraising agencies, which probably may have some funds available with them. So we can join hand with them. For instance, United Nations mechanism and the different, in fact, NGOs, they have been already engaged some socio-economic, environmental, and other areas as well. So we can approach, for instance, if we looking into the areas of the Asia and the Pacific region, so we can approach the United Nations Commission for Social and Economic Commission for Asia and Pacific. We can approach them with the solid document and ask them with the partnership arrangement if they have some fund they want to work together in terms of inviting meetings, in terms of hosting these meetings as well. So we need to identify and map those international organizations who in fact have some sort of the funding, probably by establishing some sort of the partnerships with them shall be adding our efforts towards the fundraising ability as well as concern. The second important thing, which in fact the Cynthia in fact has prepared a wonderful, all the presenters have prepared a wonderful document, and which in fact reinforce each other and tend to integrate our efforts as well. So product and services, from where to begin, it really is a big question mark as but for the stakeholders on capacity buildings, from where the background they are. They also need some sort of capacity building as well. They also need to create awareness as well. And more importantly, we need to identify the role of each and every individual, whosoever are the members of the different groups, keeping in view their background knowledge, their exposure, and perhaps their CVs can also be invited, and the Secretariat of SAN can go through them, assess the ability of the people, that what kind of a assistant, what kind of the role we can give them, what part of the role they can play to carry forward as agenda. So this is from my part. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. That's really very interesting and rich comments from you. Thank you for taking the time. Now, we've had a question from Julia that is twofold, basically, and I think she raises some good points. Maybe Lad, you might be best, because she talks about civil society, and the question is, she's wondering how the services the SAN aims to provide, let's say regarding capacity building or standard setting, knowledge sharing, will take upon work that is already being conducted on those issues by other CSOs or CSOs groups, and then following on from that, who will actually be developing the knowledge on the issues identified, Will it be developed through voluntary contributions from members, by the steering committee, or consultants? Lad, you've done quite a bit of work on this. Are you able to jump in here?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Margaret Ann. Those are great questions. I think, certainly on the first part, obviously we don't want to duplicate great work that's already been done. I know, by Adaptation Fund Network, and also I know the Green Climate Fund, some of the observers, I guess it was actually German Watch that put out a great study on, the Green Climate Fund. So, we want to build on those, and those things don't need to be replicated. But the SAN does, have kind of a different niche looking across all the funds. So looking at what are the sort of common elements across those, about the role of observers. So I think, that's the niche the SAN has, is that it's covering all funds and looking sort of at what are commonalities there. And in terms of who will actually be doing the work, I think, it's not 100% determined at this point. We do not actually have any employees of the SAN at this point. We do have, the benefit of having a coordinator for the steering committee. That's Cynthia Gayers, who you heard from at the start of this webinar, and Andres has also served as sort of an advisor for us, and so it's possible, that they might be engaged, or it could be the members. It's entirely possible that there are members of the SAN who would be well placed to do this kind of work. And really, one of the things we most would like to do is to take advantage of the capacity that does exist in the SAN, and for those who would have the ability to work on these kinds of issues, to engage them in that work. But that's where we stand right now. It could be, volunteer work. It could be consultants. If the SAN eventually has a staff member, it could be done by the staff member. So there are lots of things still to work out, but there are lots of possibilities. So I hope.
Sorry, were you and Andreas? I think maybe you might want to jump in here if you can, because you're actually, a consultant to the SAN. You've put a lot of work in this, and also I think what's interesting about Julia's question is, and I'm guessing it's because she's coming from the Adaptation Fund and the network, and not every constituency is as organized, I would say, as that. So really this is about, I think, pulling together resources. But I really think, Andreas, I'd love to hear what you think, because none of this is set in stone, but I do think Lad's point of pulling together the best resources, that the most appropriate resources that we have, are really important. But Andreas, I'd love to hear what you think on that.
Just a quick thought on top of what Lad said. Obviously, the idea is not to duplicate, but to jointly coordinate. The SAN has a very specific mandate, and that's probably the key to answering the question. So if you look at climate change as a whole and across climate finance and a range of issues, you'd have networks like CAN and others that have a much broader, much more high-level mandate. And then you can look at the micro level. You have the CSO networks that are focused on specific climate funds. The SAN is looking at common challenges across those different networks and opportunities for collaboration across those networks, but with a specific mandate of looking at how to empower the voice of observers, the voice of civil society representatives, which when we look at it, have a nearly impossible task. The observers are tasked with something that is very hard to do if you take it seriously, in terms of representing constituencies across the globe, making informed decisions based on a ton of material that is put out by the funds at various levels, at the policy level, at the project level, reporting back to those constituencies. So it really is a nearly impossible task, given the current level of capacity, given the current level of resourcing, given the current level of accessibility to information. And it's leveraging that, the capacity of the observers to express their voice and for that to be acted upon, that the SAN is solely focused. So we're not necessarily proposing that the SAN is doing the monitoring of projects or necessarily taking positions on the role of on the policies of the funds themselves. That's the observers' work. And many of the CSO observer networks that are fund specific will have more of that political action, taking position, coordinating the voice. The SAN is about leveraging that voice. So I see ample opportunity for collaboration across the different CSO networks.
Thanks so much. And I think maybe just to round this up, we might want to actually hear from Claudia, because she's got experience as an observer, but also just as an Indigenous people. So Claudia, do you have anything to say to close this loop before we move on to the next question?
Yes, thank you, Margaret. Just to implement what Lat and Andres told us, is because SAN got an added value, and we think that maybe it could create new resources, including comparative assessments and best practices model for observers. Other added value that we had identified that it develops standards for stakeholder engagement in climate finance mechanisms. It builds capacity of new observers, as Lat told us before, and also it ensures consistency and continuity among observers. It provides a platform for knowledge and information exchange that many observers could maybe can improve the standards by their own experiences that each observer has, and the learned lessons to improve many mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for that. If you've got any further questions, Julia, please let us know, or if you wanted to comment, you're welcome to. In the meantime, though, we'd love to, Ellen has asked for the floor. Would you introduce yourself, where you're from, and please share your comments with us?
Thank you. I'm Ellen Lorimer. I'm with an NGO in South Africa called Indigo Development and Change, and we're also part of the Adaptation Fund NGO network. So we're here really observing today. We haven't been participating in the SAN. This raises just one of my concerns, is just looking at who's here on this call and who was participating in the last call. I know some issues will need to come up under your governance webinar, but I'm concerned that these issues are not growing out of the constituencies you were just discussing. Some of those CSO NGO networks that already exist and that play observer roles are not here. They're not part of the SAN. And I know there was a role envisioned for some of those CSO networks in the governance structure, but I don't see them there as yet, including the Adaptation Fund NGO network. So my concern is that these products and services that you're envisioning are not coming out of the constituencies they're aimed to serve. I can't speak for private sector observers. Perhaps their needs would be met here. But it's a real concern for me on the one side of who you're representing, and has this network grown out of that constituency, or is it being imposed from outside? And are these the needs that those constituencies see for themselves? And yes, I think the issue of independence is also one that you've raised in this webinar, and that needs to be revisited again and again. This is a network that has grown out of one of the funds. Perhaps it's had more engagement with the SIF CSO network, which I'm not part of and I don't know much about. But I can say for certainty that the Adaptation Fund NGO network has not been part of shaping this network or shaping these products and services that you're looking to provide. And I think it's really important to ensure that there is proper buy-in and that what you're servicing comes from those constituencies, comes from those most vulnerable, and comes from the NGO networks themselves. And I'm not seeing that clearly at the moment, including on those who are part of this call. It's a very small group here, and not many of those constituencies are represented. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen. You raised some really good points, and part of today is really about it really is about getting the buy-in from the larger observer network. You know, nothing unfortunately is built overnight. It's been 4 years, 4 long years, even to get to this point, and part of this, and I really think Cynthia would probably be the best to discuss these points. Cynthia, are you able to comment on this?
Yes, of course. I'd be very pleased to. So, Ellen, thank you so much for those very important comments and concerns. In fact, we've over the past few years been questioning precisely what you raised and trying to address it. And so if I can go back a bit, in terms of consultations and listening sessions, we've been doing that. You know, we have our assemblies. First of all, if I can go back a few years, we have member assemblies where we invite representatives from civil society, private sector, and indigenous peoples groups from across the funds to come and help us put together our strategy document, for example. It was agreed to in 2018. It's a living document, and I'd be happy to share that with you. And so, for example, we may know Leanne, if I can remember Leanne's last name. She's a former observer for the Green Climate Fund, and she's with the Heinrich Böll Foundation. She was quite instrumental in helping us draft our strategy document in 2018. We have a very close relationship with the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. I'm not certain if they're on the call today, but we had quite a few of them on our last webinar that had over 40 people participating in that one. Unfortunately, I know a lot of people have been reaching out to me and saying that their connectivity is very poor, and so particularly in Africa, where we have a lot of members. But if I'm sorry for that little digression, if I get back on track here. So what we've been doing is broadening our membership, broadening our relationships. And I've been undertaking an awful lot of that over the past couple of years by creating these listening sessions with the NGO network. So Julie will remember when I first reached out to her to try and learn more about the Adaptation Fund NGO network and how the SAN might be of benefit to the network, and how the network also would be a benefit to the SAN. And of course, she was introduced to us through Amigo, because initially we were having these listening sessions with all the secretariats. So that would be the high-level people in the secretariat, so the Adaptation Fund, the Green Climate Fund, you know, all the way up to the top, and the Jeff. We have a relationship with Dr. Nico and the front office there. And so we have been engaging, expanding our relationships, and trying to learn more about the other funds, what their needs are specifically. And so, interestingly, out of a listening session with the chair of the Jeff's NGO network, some of these ideas actually came from, and that's what they are. These are ideas. These are not products and services we're trying to force on anyone. These are proposed products and services. And we are, for example, today, we're pleased to have you here. We'd like to know, if you'd like to speak more, how you feel that where the synergies are with the Adaptation Fund, with what we're proposing, what would help you? So that would be so very helpful for both of us, I think. And additionally, not just with the high-level secretariats and the NGO networks, we're also building relationships with the bilateral donors. As Lad mentioned, we've had 2 or 3 very, very good meetings with them, and obviously they also fund your organizations, and they've actually been giving us guidance, on sort of the proof of concept, the sort of things that they think would be helpful for civil society organizations. And so with that said, I'd like to invite you and Julia to share with us maybe a bit about the Adaptation Fund, and I know that you are growing and expanding as well, and I know that capacity building was something that's very important for you to provide for your own network, and maybe you can explain to us a bit about how you're going about that, what the status of that is now, and any synergies that you think between the SAN and the Adaptation Fund might exist, and how we might help one another. Thank you.
Yeah, before we jump in on that and ask that, we do have someone from the governance, and I know Julie's raised her hand, but Andrea is actually here on the governance, part of the governance committee. Could you speak briefly, because Julie wants to comment on this, but could you comment briefly, Andrea, on the governance part?
Thank you, Margaret. Yes, hello, Erin. So I'm from the private sector. And as you mentioned, we are a little different than civil society, but not in all areas. But in general, what we are working on the governance group, and you will see it next week, is really how we can do exactly what you are asking, like really engage at large all the networks and ensure that all the big networks are engaged, particularly from the CISO, the indigenous, and the private sector. And you will also see there's quite an extensive planning already on how we will do elections with, with pre-nominations, it's quite an extensive procedure which is established, and we will present it at the next governance call. And there really the idea is also to really extend massively the network and re-engage. We were a little unlucky, as you probably know, that our General Assembly now had twice to be postponed, once because Chile, the COP, was moved to Madrid, and once because of the coronavirus, we couldn't be in Kenya. So we are waiting also really very much to have our fall General Assembly, where we can unite as many observers as we can, as we did 2 years ago, and really then also have there the final vote for the next steering committee, discuss the bylaws or a framework for how the SAN works to make governance very clear, who is doing what, how is it working, but also to present in much more details the networks we are working with and how we will engage them, and also how the networks want to engage with the SAN and how this works. The group is a bit bigger. Happy to talk further as a group with you, of course. And at the next webinar, we will discuss in detail the election procedure and network engagement.
Thank you so much. But Julia, I think you had some comments. Do you want to unmute and maybe share them with us?
Yes. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Speak up just a tiny bit if you can, please.
Yes, I'm getting closer to the mic.
Okay.
Yeah, just one thing I wanted to clarify, because actually, at least for the Adaptation Fund NGO network, we are not receiving any funding from the Adaptation Fund. So our work is funded by, on the one side, by voluntary contributions of members that provide our contributions to the network, and on the other side, we received some funding from the ICI, from the German Environmental Ministry, to do some general coordination work for the network, set up our regional hubs, and so on. Yeah, and actually at the moment we are developing some positions on, or some ideas on how the Adaptation Fund could further support also CSO engagement in the fund, could potentially fund active CSO observers if they will be introduced, or CSOs travel costs that are contributing to the Adaptation Fund CSO dialogue, and so on. And when I heard that also the Sun approached the Adaptation Fund Secretariat regarding funding for stakeholder engagement, I think it's a bit difficult for us. We felt a bit like, okay, this really needs to be also thought together with our asks we're actually having regarding some funding we are asking from the Secretariat, for example, for mainly travel costs, because we think travel costs are not are not risking our independence if we decide who will be traveling, and they're just covering travel costs and so on. Yeah, but I think many of the AFCSOs would have liked to engage before with the Sun, before hearing from the Adaptation Fund Secretariat, actually, that you approach them regarding funding, because we're having our own thoughts on this. And I think it's just something that has to be coordinated with the existing CSO networks and their asks they are having regarding support from the Fund Secretariat, also regarding their support for travel costs and so on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. That's very interesting what you're saying. Now, we have Sudhata who wants to make a comment, and as well, one thing I've noticed that Asil is here, and she's with the FCPF, the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. I'd be very curious if either we're going to take Asil and Sudhata, but recognize maybe what she sees as important for her network. Maybe if you could do that. Asil, would you be willing to share with that, or before we move on to Seduto?
Good morning, everybody. I'm sorry I joined a little bit later, and I'm very interested in this discussion because I represent the Climate Change Fund Management Unit, and we have several funds, climate finance funds, which are, one of them is FCPF and ISFL, where we engage observers from CSOs and indigenous peoples. And we are also very keen to see how this governance system is going to be built. And I think this is where the key will be for mobilizing resources, because for us it's important to have observers who represent constituencies and also report back to constituencies. So that's one of the principles of engaging them in all our partnership meetings, so they can not only express their own opinion, but opinion of the constituencies they represent. So it's, we are following very closely on science development, and we really hope to find synergies. And I'm also interested to participate in your governance section and to hear how you will be suggesting for all climate funds, at least in our unit, to participate in this process. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's really great. Seduto, you had a question, and I know we need to address this competition of funds. But before that, maybe we could open the floor to your comments, Suduta. Could you tell us where you're calling from and what you represent?
Okay, thank you. Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, so I am from Indigenous People constituency. I'm from Africa and SIP observer. I'm in Burkina Faso, and calling you now from Ouagadougou. It's very hot. So I'm very happy to join this meeting because many times I try, but I don't have a good internet access. I think it's very important for SAN member observers to join this meeting because of corona issues now situation. We don't have another space where we can share information and adapt. Yeah, have new information, exchange, especially this kind of dialogue. We don't have any space if not this one. So we need to use it. And I want also to highlight that our SAN board member need to participate, because I think this discussion is very important and they have responsibility for every subject that is in discussion, especially this one today. So it's what I want to just share with you. It's my view. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so important to know that this is part of the whole service of that is really about what the broader observer network needs, not just what one constituency needs. So we've got, maybe Lad, you can, maybe we've got a few hands up. Maybe Lad, we can go with you. Are you ready to take the floor? There's two things I think you wanted to discuss, and then I think Cynthia had something as well.
Sure. Thank you, Margaret Ann. I'd actually like to go back a little bit to Ellen's original question, or the issue that the SAN did not grow out of constituencies. And, it's absolutely right. The SAN was established in its origin by a resolution of the Trust Fund Committee of the Climate Investment Funds. So that is the origin story of the SAN. That being said, that resolution was made by the Trust Fund Committee with the observers who were members of the SIF, who took part in that meeting. I think but the fact that it didn't grow 100% organically is somewhat reflected in the slow start that the SAN has gotten. That it didn't just expand and grow in a very quick way. But the SAN has been evolving, and I think one of the things that I would like to point out is that we have these working groups now that have engaged members from all the different constituencies, from private sector, from indigenous peoples organizations, and from civil society. So we have these different constituencies that are active in the working group. So we have a working group on elections and governance. We have this working group on products and services that Claudia was speaking on behalf of. The working group on, working on resource mobilization that Margaret Ann and I have worked on. So we have one on membership. So there is an organic existence to the SAN at this point, thanks to these working groups. And then the second thing is, we're not done yet. These webinars are actually sort of our initial stages of making sure that we do reach out. And you know, frankly, it's been a problem. We haven't had the capacity to do much outreach, but this webinar series is a part of that. And so we really value hearing from you and getting feedback like this. So yes, it wasn't a great origin story, but we're working on it. We have some modalities for addressing it, and you know, we're hoping that, you know, by doing things, some of which can be free. There's not necessarily competition for funds. You know, for activities like this, we can hold a webinar for virtually no cost, except for the time that people put into it. So those are my thoughts, and I hope that helps answer some of your concern.
Thanks so much. I think it was Ellen is next. Her hand has been up for a while. Sorry, there's quite a few people. I'm not sorry. I'm delighted to hear these discussions. They're rich, and thanks for reminding us that it wasn't, you know, it's been 4 years in the making, and this is still in progress. Ellen, would you like, you have the floor.
Apologies, that was up for before. I'll continue to engage through the next webinar on the governance issues as well and try and get a more formal response. So apologies for that.
Okay, no problem, no problem. Cynthia, did you want to, you were next, you wanted to reach out about what Asil had mentioned about the FCPF?
Yeah, so first of all, Asil, it's so nice to have you here. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I'm really glad to see you. And thank you for your comments. I also wanted to thank you for your engagement, your past support, and your predecessors' past support while we worked to bring this on to full operationalization. As you know, a number of your observers, the FCPF observers, for a few years now, have been not just interested in the sun, but participating. So, for example, in 2018, we had 3 or 4 FCPF observers join an initial sort of consultation and listening group, and out of that they wanted to participate in our 2018 assembly, and your predecessor Asil very graciously sponsored them to join us in Washington, and it was very good to have them in the room and to hear their opinions and how the sun could add value to their work. And then now we've been, for the past year, trying to hold our next forum and assembly, and we just haven't had very good luck between Chile and then Madrid, and then having to postpone our Nairobi forum and assembly due to COVID, where so much of this would have been discussed, but now it's truncated in our little webinar series. But Asil, I wondered if you might share a bit more about, you know, even this year you were willing to support and sponsor some of your FCPF participants in Nairobi, because you see value, or at least potential value, in the sun and how it would assist your observers. I think you had mentioned particularly in capacity building, and I wondered if you might like to share just a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Cynthia. I think we are very interested to see what services Sun can offer to our funds in terms of, as you said, capacity building, but also capacity building in terms of negotiation skills, leadership skills, you know, understanding more the technical issues of Paris Agreement and other climate change related discourse which is going on global level. So first they can actively participate as observers in our processes of developing programs and developing specific interventions, but also to transfer that down to their constituencies. So that's for us, it's very important to have this resource which can help us to build capacity, but also in terms of governance. We are following the same scheme as received us in terms of self-selection, which is I'm still not fully understanding the process and how the self-selection is going, but it would be great to have as many networks. I'm happy to hear that there are other networks here to be connected, because we also have a network of IP organizations and CSOs. More than 80 organizations received grants from capacity building programs within the last 5 years. You know, it's more than $10 million. And now we are extending another $5 million for next year and a half for IP organizations, CSOs, to participate in country level discussions on climate change and Red Plus specifically. So this is where I think SAN can be very important to bring all these networks together. Sorry, so it's a second area where I see our need for your services. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing with us. Now, we're conscious of the time. We're due to finish in 3 minutes, but we did get started 5 minutes later. So for those that have to go, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. But for those that can stay, we'll ask 5 more minutes to really maybe to get to one last question. I know we're going to follow up with any outstanding or remaining questions. We'll follow up with you. But in the meantime, maybe Andreas, would you be able to switch and maybe talk about that last slide? So those that have to leave, we totally understand. We want to respect your time. However,
Excuse me.
Yes.
Before you invite Andreas, so let me propose 1 minute to observe, 1 minute silence to pay homage to those that who have lost their lives in view of COVID-19.
Thank you, Mohammed, for suggesting that. Yes, none of us are, it's a really tricky time for all of us. At the same time, for those of us, what matters is the meaning in our lives, to hopefully doing some meaningful work. And this is one of the reasons why I volunteered to help on this. In the resource mobilization. And one of the last things we wanted to do, and maybe you could put this in chat, and just literally in chat, and would you like to play a role in the development of the SAN? There's opportunities to work on development of products and services, on resource mobilization or other working groups, and the coordinating committee, which will be through elections. That will be a separate webinar that will talk around that. There'll be a governance webinar. But what is the most appealing in terms of active engagement for you? Let's say Julia and Erin have raised good points of governance, then we'd welcome them to help coordinate that. If there's anything specific that you'd like to do, all we'd ask you to do is maybe put your answers into chat around this, rather than opening up. We've only got 5 minutes, and I've got some final words. So if there is anything specific that you'd like to work on, or be interested in working with us on the products and services, please either get in touch with us, get in touch with Cynthia. But I think everybody knows who Cynthia is. She's wonderful at helping coordinate this. or obviously put it on chat now. And if not, it doesn't look like I'm necessarily getting any of these things. I think we've finished. I think we've finished, and we had a rich discussion today. Thank you so much, especially for the external people that have joined us, because the thing is, we're not developing this in a vacuum. We certainly don't want to, but it's really this is part of building something like this with when there isn't necessarily already something ready-made to go is tricky. And the thing that this is basically goes back to what Lad pointed this out last time on the discussion, if you were there, and it's really, we're around three main points, which is why we all need the SAN. It's from the perspectives of the climate funds or their secretariats. There's the participating governments and the members and the non-state stakeholders. So for the climate funds, it's this notion that the SAN can help set standards for the role of observers and for engaging with non-state stakeholders more generally. It's very appealing. It puts them more in line with the evolution of development finance more generally, which is to have standards for stakeholder engagement. The World Bank has done it with its ESS 10, and the IDB has proposed it in its draft ESPS 10. Of course, the role of observers is really a subset of stakeholders, but the observers represent large constituencies that are key to effective climate finance. For governments that are the donors, they want to have accountability to ensure that the funds are being well used. Now, I think it's true that whether you're a donor or a beneficiary, the donors obviously want to know that the funds are being spent in ways that are going to have impact, whether it's to mitigate climate change or to adapt to its benefits, to its impact, sorry. And observers who are empowered and based on standards are more capable, particularly if we've got training. If you think about it from a private sector perspective, people that bring on non-executive directors, they're often, they have a whole onboarding process to get that person with that specialty up to speed. That's what we want to help coordinate and facilitate. The demand for transparency and providing accountability, it just increases. So we're really on this. For the beneficiary government, they want to ensure that they avoid mistakes. And one of the ways to do this is to have observers come in. They want to make sure that they've got proper stakeholder engagement. But governments, particularly the beneficiary governments, but all governments, they face capacity issues, constraints, and the benefit of having these non-state stakeholders to address the issues that they know they need, and sometimes they don't even know they need them. That's why these special constituencies can come in and actually make things aware of these issues that they hadn't actually thought of. Now, for the SAN members, I think the role of the SAN is most important of all. Members, we need to be able to represent our constituencies, to give voice, and especially to those who've been denied a voice in the past. But up till now, there's not a framework or a support. And the SAN's goal is to provide that support in two important ways. And one is this knowledge and information and capacity building that the SAN generates, disseminating best practices through the research it will undertake and the workshops, seminars, and webinars it organizes. The second, and maybe this is the most important, is the forum it provides for peer-to-peer learning and knowledge exchange, much broader than has happened in the past, because the SAN engages different constituencies across private sector, civil society, and Indigenous people, and provides a safe space for them to work together. Now, I know this from my own experience as a private sector representative at the Green Climate Fund, at the Climate Investment Funds, and at the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. Hearing the perspectives of my colleagues in civil society and Indigenous peoples on different issues has been eye-opening for me. And more recently, working with LAD and the rest of the team on fundraising has been incredibly valuable for me, because we have to think we have to think what's best for all observers, for the group as a whole, and not just my constituency. And it's different constituencies not working with a single climate finance mechanism from all the major climate finance mechanisms. And not only current observers, but past observers as well. They've got lots of institutional knowledge. So by doing this, the SAN is helping observers to overcome the limits of time and space. We're all limited by that, and to truly broaden their perspective and understanding of effective climate finance. And that's the goal that we all want, and indeed have to achieve to have a more sustainable world. So thank you so much for joining us. Remember, there will be a next webinar. It will be on governance and elections. Since many people are finding this an important issue, Cynthia sent through, I can't remember exactly the dates, but she's organized with that. So thank you so much for joining us. Really, it's been a great, fruitful discussion, and we look forward to welcoming you on the next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Margaret Ann.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Margaret, and all the participants who are present here. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. Okay, Renata, you can probably close this. Thank you again for everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.